So I think in terms of legal precedent or court decisions in 2025, there's two or three really important judgments, two which are a positive development and one which is a very concerning one and will obviously have far-reaching consequences, particularly for women in this country facing violence and sexual abuse and all forms of violence perpetrated by men. Starting off with the positive examples, there was an order of the Islamabad High Court in writ petition number 2667 of 2024 titled Noor Fatma versus Federation of Pakistan. It was live streamed, the entire proceedings. These are the blasphemy commission proceedings. And so in 2025, Sardar Ijaz of the Islamabad High Court ordered the government to form a commission of inquiry into these cases, false blasphemy cases registered against youth for the purposes of extortion and through honey trapping, based on reports by the Special Branch of the Punjab Police and by the National Commission of Human Rights and Fact Focus. In fact, the entire proceedings were perhaps the most positive development to come out of Pakistan in the last few years, because it was the first time that a sensitive issue like these fake blasphemy cases was actually addressed in live stream proceedings where ordinary public could see how false cases are concocted against people for ulterior motives. Secondly, another positive order which also shows the impact of Sardar Ijaz's order and the far-reaching consequences in a positive way on the rights of those who face false blasphemy charges is the bail order granted by a two-member bench of the Supreme Court this year, in which they had actually referred to Sardar Ijaz's order, despite the fact that a divisional bench of the Islamabad High Court had suspended it. So I think that actually shows the strength of that order and the importance of the underlying issue that it was highlighting, which is the registration of false blasphemy cases for ulterior motives. So the Supreme Court's bail order is also a very important one in that connection. The two negative and very worrying judgments of the Supreme Court, which will also have far-reaching implications for all of our rights and our dignity, especially for women. One is the Zahir Jaffer judgment, not the entirety of the judgment, but the portions of it that make reference to live-in relationships, and you can see that the judges are giving their own conception of morality and how women should live their lives and what makes a perfect victim and what doesn't. So that obviously is going to have a very negative impact in this kind of a patriarchal society. And similarly, there's been a recent judgment of the Supreme Court where the sentence of a man was significantly reduced from, I think it was like a life sentence or 20 years, and it was turned into a charge of fornication. So that, again, is also very worrying, especially when you see this in the broader context of the fact that under judgments given by Justice Aisha Malik and Mansoor Ali Shah, there had actually been a lot of positive development in the jurisprudence on rape and sexual violence and morality and all these issues. And all of that effectively, becomes weaker when you have these sorts of judgments coming in through the Supreme Court a few years later.
So 2025 has seen quite a bit of upheaval in the legal domain, but I don't think there's anything as monumental as the 27th Constitutional Amendment. This essentially changed the entire structure of the Supreme Court. It bifurcated its roles. The Supreme Court now is basically an appellate body, and the new Federal Constitutional Court has taken the adjudicative function on constitutional matters and has been given jurisdiction over that solely. And that's pretty wide discretion, because ultimately, there's a lot which could even fall within the appellate domain, which is really a constitutional matter as well, because ultimately everything emanates from the Constitution, right? And so that's a concern there. You're going to have overlapping jurisdictions, and you're going to have problems there. We also have a completely different composition for the Judicial Commission, and so the way judges are appointed, whether it's to the Supreme Court, the High Courts, the Federal Shariat Court, or the Federal Constitutional Court, this will now be done, whereas previously you had, say, a theoretical veto with the superior judiciary. So there was a block of judges that had equal voting power, and they could block, say, an appointment if they, assuming that they voted together. Now the judiciary is basically in a minority. And so that, I think, is a factor there.
The legal precedent that will leave the longest impact on the citizenry in 2025 is not one that happened, it's the one that didn't happen. The fact that the Supreme Court did not intervene in the capture of the judicial system by the executive through the 26th and later the 27th Amendments, the fact that the Supreme Court did not stand up for an independent judiciary by answering the plea of the Islamabad High Court judges who were pleading and complaining of executive interference will be the gravest error that will mark a curtailment of rights of the citizenry, a decision that did not happen when it should have.
I think the justice system's biggest weakness was visible in terms of the top institution which heads the justice system, which is the Supreme Court, and its internal failure to protect itself as an institution and to assert its independence. So, if we begin from the letter of the six Islamabad High Court judges, which was issued last year, and the Supreme Court's failure this year to take any kind of action on it, and to even talk about the idea of potential interference into the affairs of the judiciary. And then we saw the 26th and the 27th Amendment, even though we were told that these amendments were being passed to improve access to justice and increase efficiency in the system and reduce pendency. Given the content and the way these amendments were passed, it was quite clear that these amendments were designed to defang the judiciary and to completely sort of take away its power to assert itself as an independent pillar of the state. And given these amendments, we saw that the judiciary was completely divided, and it was unable to sort of get over these divides within the institution to protect the institution as a whole. And as a result, we saw complete capitulation before the executive. And right now we can see how the Supreme Court and the Federal Constitutional Court are essentially now arms of the executive as opposed to being independent pillars. So when the top institution that heads the justice system is completely unable to assert itself as an independent institution, that obviously has a effect on the lower courts, the high courts, and the trial courts, the plenary courts, the civil courts. And I think that this is going to have like a really long-term impact in terms of how justice is delivered in this country.
I don't think there is any due process in Pakistan. And I think that this year we've actually seen, really horrific miscarriages of justice, abuse of the legal system and the criminal justice system. I think some of the biggest cases are those of Dr. Marang Baloch and the Baloch Yekjehti Committee's entire leadership, which for like over 3 months was kept under detention under the MPO. Then there was repeated physical remand given of them in various baseless, concocted, fake terrorism cases, one after the other, and they've been in jail for like almost 10 months now. And no part of the legal system, all the way from the courts in Balochistan, the trial court, all the way up to the Supreme Court, has been able to remedy that injustice or provide even a little glimmer of relief for these people. Similarly, I think if you look at Ali Wazir's case, that also shows that the state misusing the law can ensure prolonged, unjustified, and arbitrary detention and incarceration without any due process. So basically, the rights that are safeguarded in your constitution of fair trial, of due process, of the right to dignity, equal protection of the law, equality before the law, all of these rights are effectively nullified. And I think it would be incomplete to not mention the fact that we've had court orders this year prior to that as well for meetings with Imran Khan, of his lawyers, of his family members, and those court orders have also been flouted. So every time there's like a contempt petition filed or there's any attempt at fixing an early hearing in the case, we see that the courts are completely non-responsive. So I think that after the 26th and 27th constitutional amendments, there is no due process in Pakistan, and that is by design.
This year also saw the conclusion of the Noor Muqaddam case, where the Supreme Court upheld Zahir Jaffer, the accused, his conviction for murder and rape, as well as the death penalty that he got for these offences. I think this case will will certainly bring much needed closure to Noor's family, but also to society, because this was a high profile case. This was followed throughout Pakistan, and it also symbolized a number of very serious issues with our society. One being women being particularly vulnerable in our society, regardless of their class affiliation, regardless of how affluent they may be. It certainly exposed that. It also looked at class and how there's this expectation almost now in Pakistan that if you belong to the upper echelons of society, if you come from a particular economic background, then the law really does not apply to you. And affluence can get you out of the worst situations. And I think the element that the entire country's eyes were on this case was also a factor that led to that pressure, really led to this conviction and this case really going to its logical conclusion. Otherwise, we've sadly seen in Pakistan where the rich have been able to pressurize victims who are from different backgrounds, less privileged backgrounds. They're able to buy them off, or they're able to pressurize them in some other way, or they're able to derail the investigation, because as we all know, that the investigation is an exceptionally fragile process, and anyone involved in this who has even some of the even a bit of a negative intent can derail an investigation and lead to acquittals. And so that's what we see happening here. So it's really good that we can have this closure as a society. But when we're talking about some of these issues, one thing that I was exposed to personally was the type of victim blaming that really became real for me, right? That even in such a heinous situation where, just the nature of the crime, we still had people, victim blame in this case. And we even had a Supreme Court judge, Justice Ali Bakr Najfi, who made a remark in the same vein, living relationships and whatnot. And this remark, it had little legal bearing. Like it didn't have any real significance in terms of the legal consequences, but it certainly diluted the impact on society, right? Because a judicial decision is ultimately the state condemning. It's the state's reprobation of murder, of a particular offense. And when the state dilutes it by making these statements, or a representative of the state like the Supreme Court Justice, that is where it becomes seriously problematic.
Due process was dealt further blows that it has been dealt continuously since the 8th February 2024 elections, where people have been deprived of their fundamental rights to fair trial and due process in everything related to the May 9th cases, and everything related to public violence that have instead been branded as terrorism, where political party workers have been tried under the guise of being terrorists, or even under the guise of treason, under military acts where they are deprived of even the basic rights of counsel, the rights of appeal, the right to see evidence being led against them. And these due process rights were dealt further blows in the cases of higher profile victims such as Imran Khan himself, but also his party workers who were targeted as examples to be set for the rest of us.
In my opinion, the most consequential legal decision which has and will continue to affect citizen rights will be the Supreme Court judgment upholding the legality of military trials of civilians accused in the May 9 cases. If we recall, previously the court had declared military trials of citizens to be illegal, but then the Supreme Court, in an appeal filed by the government, reinstated Section 21D and 59(4) of the Army Act, which permit military jurisdiction over civilians in specific circumstances. So this decision, in my opinion, fundamentally alters the relationship between the states and citizens, where any civilian can now, if accused of certain offences which can be tied to national security in any manner, or tied to, state institutions in any manner, can now be prosecuted potentially by a military court. And we understand, knowing how military courts operate, where the procedure is very opaque, we don't understand under what criteria cases are referred to military trials, the location of trial, the timing of trial, what evidence is used against, it's all very opaque. So this decision essentially strips every citizen of the right to fair trial, which is a fundamental right guaranteed in our constitution. It also, fundamentally undermines the principle of independence of judiciary, where judges who are a part of the military are carrying out these trials. They're part of the executive branch. So the principle of judiciary, the independence of judiciary from the executive, that is under attack. And then the right to appeal to civilians is also not available. Public hearings are not available. So if you look at it in that context, where we are, due to this decision, we are now in a very, very precarious situation where any citizen potentially is under the threat of facing a military trial should they commit an offense that can be tied to national security, or that can be brought under the jurisdiction of Section 21D and 59(4) of the Army Act.
Look, Pakistan has never had a perfect justice system, and there are obvious structural reasons for that, in that you invest so little into your justice system, into your legal structure, and you invest your money as a state and your resources into defense, into various other things which are not really priorities for any developing country. So in terms of structural flaws, I think those have always existed, and the justice system has never been a priority. Dispensation of justice or access to justice has never been a priority. But what we've seen in particular after the 26th and 27th Amendment is that the little bit of responsiveness from the judiciary, or the minute degree of protection of your fundamental rights through constitutional courts, even that has been impaired through the 26th and 27th Amendments.
The structural flaw in the judicial system is once again the capture of the entire judiciary at the hands of the executive. And this flaw has, for every day that it is not corrected, will continue to expose itself and the policies surrounding it, that these amendments were made with anything but the capture of the judicature in mind. And these exposures will hopefully lead to a further and further realization that the citizenship is further insecure and further denuded of rights in this new constitutional era.
And finally, I think a couple of instances that happened in the last year, which were fairly disappointing from a gender justice point of view, and will potentially have an impact on women's perception of the justice system and their ability and willingness to access it. Firstly, being Justice Bakir Najfi's note in the Noor Muqaddam case, where he decided to use his note to moralize about the so-called vice of living relationships, and how he, tried to use this idea of societal decay and how it's leading to an uptick in crimes against women. It was fairly disappointing to see that coming from the Supreme Court, because it again reiterates the idea of victim blaming and us not being able to empathize with victims because they do not fall into our mold of what a perfect victim should look like. So one, that was fairly disappointing. And the other recent judgment where the Supreme Court converted a rape charge into a fornication charge, even though there was no evidence on record to establish any kind of consent for sexual relationship by the woman. That again was very, very disappointing to see, because it makes it very difficult for a woman to report rape, because the idea will always be that if not rape, then this can get converted into fornication, which could potentially expose her to legal sanction. So in terms of gender justice also, we saw, in my opinion, a regression, a decline, which again, obviously it makes things harder for women, and which makes the justice system harder for women to access and to use to get justice. And it, given that Pakistan fares so badly on the on the gender index, we need to obviously be doing better on that front as well. So, in my opinion, due process has definitely weakened over the last year or so. Post the general elections of 2024, the passage of the 26th and the 27th Amendment, the case of the YouTuber Ducky Bhai, again, also a good example of how state functionaries have gotten increasingly emboldened to abuse and exploit their powers